The letter arrived on a Thursday, which was the same day Meredith Voss realized she had exactly 11 days to reclaim everything that had been taken from her. She read it twice, standing in the narrow hallway of the boarding house on Clement Street, still wearing her coat, the envelope paper soft from the humidity that had settled into everything that autumn. The solicitor's handwriting was precise and cool. The estate of Harrowfield will pass to the surviving household as administered by Mrs. Sybil Voss, pending the Duke of Caldervane's review of all outstanding claims. Any party wishing to present evidence of prior entitlement must do so in person at Harrowfield no later than the 14th of October. 11 days. Meredith folded the letter. She folded it again. Then she sat down on the bottom stair, still in her coat, and let herself feel the full weight of it. Not the grief, which she had already carried so long it had become structural, the way a scar becomes part of the body, but the specific, clarifying anger that came from knowing exactly who had done this and exactly how. Her stepmother had done it cleverly. Meredith would give her that. Sybil Voss had waited until the right season, until Meredith had been away at her aunt's long enough that the staff had started to think of her as a visitor, until the solicitor's office had changed hands, and the new man didn't know the difference between what the will said and what Sybil chose to tell him it said. And then she had moved, not loudly, quietly, the way water moves through stone. By the time Meredith understood what was happening, Harrowfield's accounts had been redirected, the housekeeper had been replaced, and Sybil had written to every relevant party in the county to introduce herself as the primary guardian of the Voss estate. There was one name Meredith kept returning to: the Duke of Caldervane. He was new to the title. His father had died the previous spring, and from what she had gathered, the son was methodical, private, and had the unhelpful combination of being well respected and not particularly interested in other people's problems. He would not be easy to appeal to, and Sybil would have already reached him first, would have already arranged the story in the most favorable light, would have... And this was the part that made Meredith's jaw tighten, framed Meredith herself as the difficult one, the estranged one, the one who had walked away. She had not walked away. She had been driven out so gradually that by the time she recognized the pattern, she was already gone. 11 days. She went upstairs, pulled out the single trunk she owned, and started to think. The problem was not getting into Harrowfield. The problem was getting in as herself. If she arrived as Meredith Voss, daughter of the late Aldous Voss, legitimate heir to the estate, Sybil would have her removed within the hour. She had done it before, with a cousin who had come asking questions. Quietly, efficiently, with a solicitor's letter, and a locked gate and a footman who had clearly been told exactly what to say. Sybil was very good at paperwork. But if Meredith arrived as someone else, someone with a reason to be inside the house, with access to the records room, with time to find what she needed, that was a different calculation entirely. She knew Harrowfield better than anyone living. She had grown up in every corner of it. She knew which drawer in the study held her father's personal correspondence, which ledger had been kept separate from the household accounts, which key hung on which hook in the butler's pantry. She knew the back stairs and the linen cupboard and the loose board on the second landing that creaked no matter how carefully you stepped. What she needed was a position. Something that explained her presence without drawing attention. Something that got her close enough to the records to find the document she was looking for. Her father's second amendment to his will, the one Sybil claimed had never existed. She had 3 days to arrange it before she needed to be on the road. By the end of the first day, she had written to a woman in town she had known slightly years ago, who had once mentioned her sister-in-law ran a domestic placement agency. By the end of the second day, she had a reply and then a referral. By the end of the third day, She had a letter of introduction identifying her as Miss Wren, recently of a household in Bracebridge, available for immediate placement as a lady's companion or housekeeping assistant. She left on a gray October morning, the trunk sent ahead, carrying only a bag, and the letter and the specific quiet resolve of someone who has already decided the only way forward is through. Harrowfield was exactly as she remembered, and nothing like she remembered. The gates were the same. The long drive with the beeches on either side, the way the light came through in the afternoon, in long, slanted columns, all of it the same. But there was a new gravel on the drive, laid unevenly, and the east garden had been dug up and replanted in a style that had nothing to do with the original design. Small things. The kind of changes a person makes when they're trying to establish that something belongs to them now. Meredith kept her eyes straight ahead and walked to the servants' entrance. The housekeeper who met her was a Mrs. Rendell, a narrow woman with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead and the expression of someone who had too much to do and was skeptical about help. She looked at the letter of introduction, looked at Meredith, looked at the letter again. "You're younger than I was told to expect," she said. "I've been told that before," Meredith said pleasantly. Mrs. Rendell made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disagreement. "The household is in a particular state this week. His Grace arrived 2 days ago, and the mistress has been—" She paused, choosing words with visible care, managing a great many things at once. "We need someone who can work without being managed. Can you do that?" "Yes," Meredith said. It was the truest thing she'd said in 3 days. She was given a small room off the back corridor, told the meal times, and handed a list of duties that amounted to whatever Mrs. Rendell needed whenever she needed it. It was not a prestigious position. It was exactly what she had asked for. She spent the first day learning the shape of the house again, which rooms were being used, where the Duke was likely to be, where Sybil was most likely to be, and most importantly, where the records room was being kept, and whether it was locked. It was locked. Of course it was locked. But the key, she discovered on the second day, hung in the butler's pantry. Third hook from the left, just as it always had. Some things, at least, didn't change. She had not counted on the Duke being the way he was. She had expected someone formal and distant and preoccupied, a man who dealt in documents and titles and had no particular interest in the people who worked in the houses he reviewed. That was what the gossip had suggested. Her mental image of the Duke of Caldervane was a man at a desk, with papers, somewhere in the background of events. The reality of Lord Ashton Greaves was rather more inconvenient. He was, first of all, observant, in the way that some people are observant, not obviously, not with the performance of attention, but quietly and consistently, the kind of noticing that you only realize has happened after the fact. On her third morning, she passed him in the back corridor near the kitchen, carrying a tray of correspondence for Mrs. Rendell. He stepped aside to let her pass, which she had not expected, and then said, without making a particular occasion of it, "The third step on the back stairs is loose. Someone should see to it before anyone is hurt," she said. "Yes, Your Grace," and kept walking. But she thought about it afterward. She had not stepped carefully on that stair. She had known about it for 15 years, and so she had stepped over it without thinking, automatically, the way you do with things that are simply part of the landscape of a place you know well. And he had noticed. She was more careful after that. The trouble was that being more careful around him required being more aware of him, which had the unfortunate effect of making her more aware of him generally. He was in the study most mornings. He walked in the evening, always the same route, out to the south garden, along the low stone wall that bordered what had once been the kitchen garden, back through the side gate. He ate with Sybil at dinner, with the determined courtesy of a man fulfilling an obligation he has decided in advance to complete without complaint. He did not appear to enjoy it. Sybil, for her part, was managing him with considerable skill. She had positioned herself as the competent one, the steadying influence, the woman who had kept Harrowfield running through years of difficulty. Every conversation Meredith was near enough to overhear had the same subtext. Things were chaotic before, I brought order, and anything that complicates that order is a problem. Meredith, in Sybil's version of events, was the complication. She had heard it once, standing just outside the drawing room door, not intending to eavesdrop, but finding herself unable to move. The daughter was always difficult, Sybil had said in the measured tone of a woman offering regrettable facts. Her father indulged her, which I understand. She was his first child, and he loved her. But she had no sense of responsibility. When things became hard, she left. We haven't had reliable word from her in 2 years. A pause. Then the Duke's voice, which was lower and harder to read. And the amendment to the will that was mentioned in the correspondence. A misunderstanding, Sybil said smoothly. My husband's solicitor has confirmed the original document stands. The original solicitor, or the current one. A very small pause. I'm not sure I follow the distinction, Your Grace. There were 2 solicitors. The one who drew up the will and the one currently managing the estate. They're different men. I was asking which one you consulted. Meredith pressed her back against the wall of the corridor and breathed very carefully. I'll have to check my correspondence, Sybil said, in the tone of a woman who has no intention of checking her correspondence. Please do, the Duke said. She found the document on the 5th night. It was not in the records room, which was where she had spent 2 fruitless evenings going through files by lamplight while everyone slept. It was in her father's study, which Sybil had converted into a kind of sitting room. The desk pushed aside, new furniture arranged, the bookshelves reorganized. Someone had tried to make it unrecognizable. But the small locked compartment built into the wall behind the 3rd bookcase from the window was still there, because it had been built into the structure of the house itself, and you couldn't simply move it. Meredith had the key to it, had always had the key to it. Her father had given it to her when she was 14 and said, "This is yours, and nothing in this room is yours more than this." Her hands were steadier than she expected when she opened it. The amendment was inside, dated 14 months before her father died, witnessed by 2 men whose names she recognized, written in her father's unmistakable hand. It specified, in plain and unambiguous language, that the estate was to pass to his daughter Meredith upon his death, with a provision for Sybil's residence and maintenance, but with the primary management to rest with the daughter. It was exactly what she had believed existed. It was exactly what Sybil had claimed did not. She stood there for a long moment in the dark, the document in her hands, and felt something she didn't have a good name for. Not triumph, not yet, not with everything still precarious, but a specific, deep relief at being right, at not having invented it, at knowing that the thing she had come here to find was real. She was halfway back down the corridor when she heard footsteps. She went very still. The footsteps were steady and deliberate, coming from the direction of the main stairs. Not a servant. Servants moved differently at this hour, quickly and quietly, with purpose. These were the steps of someone who was awake because they chose to be, who was walking because they were thinking, who had no particular reason to hurry. She had perhaps 4 seconds. She turned toward the nearest door, a small alcove that had once held a lamp table, and pressed herself into the shadow of it, the document folded against her side, barely breathing. The Duke came around the corner. He was carrying a single candle, and the light it threw was uncertain enough that for a moment she thought he hadn't seen her. He walked past. He stopped. He turned around. The silence was long enough to be its own kind of statement. "Miss Wren," he said. She did not move. There was nothing useful she could do with her hands and no story she could tell that would hold up to a man who was, she had established by now, significantly better at noticing things than she had initially understood. "Your Grace," she said. He looked at the hand she had pressed against her side. He looked at her face. He was, she realized, not angry or not primarily angry. He was something else, thinking, perhaps, running calculations of his own. "That's not a cleaning schedule," he said, which was almost a question. "No," she said. "It isn't. Do you want to tell me what it is?" She considered briefly the various shapes a lie might take, the various small redirections, the plausible explanations, the careful partial truths. She had come in here on a deception, and she had maintained it for 5 days, and it had served its purpose. But standing here in the dark corridor with the document finally in her hand, and this man looking at her with that particular quality of attention that suggested he would not be managed, she found she was very tired of the lie. "My name is Meredith Voss," she said. "This was my father's house. And this," she held the document out because there was nothing else to do, "is the document that proves it." He took it. He read it, by candlelight, with the steady focus of a man who reads carefully and completely. He did not skim. She watched his face and learned nothing from it, and then he looked up. "How long have you been here?" he said. 5 days. Under a false name, yes. Because you believed Mrs. Voss would have you removed. I didn't believe it. I knew it. She's done it before." He was quiet for a moment. The candle flame moved in some small draft she couldn't feel. "The solicitor she consulted," he said. "It was the current one. The one who took over the practice 18 months ago. He has no familiarity with the original estate documents. I know. And the 2 witnesses on that document, he looked at the paper in his hand. Are they still living? One is. He lives in town. His name is Mr. Fordham, and he's 73 years old, and he has a very good memory." Something shifted in the Duke's expression. Not warmth, exactly. She wasn't sure yet if warmth was something he did, but a kind of recalibration, a realignment of whatever mental picture he'd been working from. "You planned this carefully," he said. "I've had 2 years to think about it. You could have come to me directly, made a formal claim." "I tried to make a formal claim," she said, and she kept her voice level because she had decided at some point in the last 30 seconds that she was going to tell him the truth, but she was not going to perform emotion for him. She was going to be plain. 18 months ago. The letter was addressed to your predecessor. It was never forwarded. He took that in." "You're certain?" "I have the original with a postmark. I brought it with me. I can give it to you tomorrow, in daylight, if you'd like to see it." He handed her back the document. She took it. "Go to bed, Miss Voss," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, the name, her actual name, that was different from everything he had said before. More considered, as though he was deciding, as he said it, that this was who she was. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. She went, but she stopped at the corner and looked back, and he was still standing there with the candle, reading something in his own expression that she couldn't see. The next morning, Sybil found out. Meredith was in the kitchen, which was where she had been every morning, when she heard the pitch of voices change in the upper part of the house, the specific frequency of Sybil's control cracking at the edges. She had not told the Duke to keep the conversation private. She had thought about it and decided that telling him what to do was not a useful strategy. What she had done was bring the postmarked letter down to breakfast and leave it with Mrs. Rendell, who had instructions to deliver it to the Duke at 8 o'clock. At 8:30, Sybil appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was immaculate. Sybil was always immaculate. It was one of the things Meredith had understood about her early on, that the presentation was armor, that the pressed dress and the composed face were the first and most consistent line of defense. She looked at Meredith, and her expression went through several calculations very quickly before settling on something that was not quite any of the things she was actually feeling. "Meredith," she said, "what a strange way to come home." "It was the way available to me," Meredith said. The kitchen was very quiet. Mrs. Rendell had found reasons to be elsewhere. The cook was doing something intensive at the far end of the room that did not require any attention. "Whatever you think you've found," Sybil said, and her voice was still smooth, still measured, "I want you to understand that I have managed this estate for years under very difficult circumstances, and your father, whatever he wrote, would not want you to." "He would want exactly what he wrote," Meredith said, "which is why he wrote it. He wasn't well. He was well enough to have 2 witnesses sign and date it." Sybil's composure held. It was impressive, actually. "You've put that poor man in a very awkward position," she said, meaning the Duke. "He didn't seem to find it awkward," Meredith said. A pause. "What did he say to you?" Meredith looked at her. "Nothing that was yours to hear." It was not the answer Sybil had expected. Meredith could see that. The small readjustment, the new calculation, the looking for a different angle, and then something else, the first visible crack in the composure. Not much, just the faintest tightening around the eyes that meant she had registered something she hadn't prepared for. What she hadn't prepared for was Meredith being unmoved in every version of this conversation that Sybil had imagined. And she would have imagined versions. That was how she operated. Meredith was either pleading or angry or frightened. She was someone who could be managed by the appropriate response. She was reacting, but Meredith was not reacting. She was just standing in her own kitchen, in the house where she had grown up, waiting for Sybil to run out of angles. Eventually, Sybil left. The formal review took 3 days. The Duke conducted it with the same methodical quietness he brought to everything. He sent for Mr. Fordham, who came and confirmed the signatures without hesitation and told 3 stories about Aldous Voss that made Mrs. Rendell cry a little in the hallway. He reviewed the original solicitor's records, which had been archived and were retrievable, as it turned out, with only moderate difficulty. He sent several letters and received several replies. Meredith went back to her duties during those 3 days. She answered when she was asked questions and otherwise stayed out of the way, which felt odd and also right. She had made her case as plainly as she could, and now it was in someone else's hands, and there was nothing more useful to be done by hovering. On the 3rd evening, she was in the small sitting room off the back corridor, reading, when the Duke knocked and came in. She stood up. "Sit down," he said, which she did, and then he took the chair across from her, which she had not expected. "I want to explain what I've found," he said, "because I think you deserve to hear it stated plainly." "Thank you," she said. He explained it plainly. The amendment was valid. The witnesses were credible. The current solicitor had been working from an incomplete set of documents and had made determinations he was not in a position to make. The estate of Harrowfield was, under the terms of Aldous Voss's final will, the responsibility of Meredith Voss, subject to the provisions for Mrs. Sybil Voss's continued residence and maintenance as specified. "There will be a formal process," he said. "It won't be immediate. But the direction is clear." She looked at him. He was watching her with that same quality of attention, and she was getting better at reading it. It was not impersonal, as she'd first thought. It was just careful. It was the attention of someone who had learned that conclusions drawn too quickly were usually wrong. "You believed me," she said. "From the beginning." He was quiet for a moment. "I believed the documents," he said. "Which is what I was there to do." But, the faintest pause. "There was a moment in the corridor," he said, "when you could have run or lied. You'd been lying successfully for 5 days. You could have constructed something." "I was tired," she said. "That wasn't why." She looked at him. He was right, and they both knew he was right, and she wasn't going to argue the point. "No," she said, "it wasn't." He nodded, very slightly, as though something had been confirmed that he had only partially needed confirmed. She stood. "The process will take some months," he said. "In the meantime, you're within your rights to remain in this house. You should probably stop sleeping in the servants' wing." "I'd grown rather used to it," she said, and then immediately wondered if that was the wrong thing to say. But something shifted in his expression. Small, brief, gone almost before she registered it. That suggested it was not the wrong thing. That suggested, in fact, that it was precisely the kind of thing he had not expected her to say, and that he found it, in some way she couldn't quite read yet, worth noting. "Miss Voss," he said, "Your Grace." He left. She sat back down, looked at the page she had been reading, found she had no idea what it said, and put the book away. The months that followed were neither simple nor easy, which she had not expected them to be. There were legal proceedings, and paperwork, and a conversation with Sybil that was not a confrontation so much as a drawing of lines that both of them understood and neither of them particularly enjoyed. Sybil remained at Harrowfield, as was her right under the terms of the will, and there were weeks when the atmosphere of the house was so carefully polite that it was almost harder than the open difficulty had been. But Meredith had known. This would be part of it. She had prepared for it. What she had not prepared for was the Duke's habit of returning. He had business in the county, which she understood, and Harrowfield was a convenient base of operations, which she also understood. And she told herself both of those things on the third occasion when his carriage appeared on the drive, and she found herself, somewhat against her better judgment, glad that it had. He was good at returning to the point of a thing. She had noticed this about him early on, and continued to notice it. The way a conversation from 2 weeks ago might surface, with the quiet precision of "I've been thinking about what you said." He was not a man who forgot. He was also not a man who performed. He asked questions when he wanted to know something, and was quiet when he didn't. He did not require managing. She found this restful in a way she hadn't anticipated and couldn't quite explain. There was an evening in late November when they were both in the library. She going through estate accounts. He reading something she hadn't asked about. And the fire had burned down to low, and she had stopped seeing the numbers, and he said, without looking up, "You haven't eaten since midday." She looked at him. "I haven't." "Neither have I." Mrs. Rendell, when applied to, produced bread and cold meat and the expression of someone who has drawn a conclusion she considers obvious and is keeping to herself. They ate at the library table with the estate accounts, pushed to one side, and talked about Harrowfield. First, which was the obvious territory, and then about other things, progressively less obvious things, until it was past 10, and they were talking about her father, and she had not spoken to anyone about her father in longer than she could easily calculate. "He would have liked you," she said, at some point, which she hadn't meant to say. "Why?" he said, not dismissing it, wanting to know. "He was bad at pretending things were other than they were," she said. "He found it uncomfortable. He always said the kindest thing you could do for anyone was to tell them plainly what you found." He was quiet for a moment. That seems like a reasonable principle. He thought so. Sybil used to say it was a liability. Something in his tone made her look up. He was looking at the fire. "Plainly then," he said, "what do you find?" She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, and then he was looking at her, and the quality of his attention was, as it had always been, neither distant nor comfortable, but something more considered than either, something that required a considered response. "I find," she said carefully, "that you are considerably more present than I understood people in your position to generally be." Meaning you're actually in the room," she said, fully. "When you're here, you're here." He was quiet for a moment. "I find," he said, with a precision that suggested he was choosing his words the same way she had chosen hers, "that you are the most direct person I have spoken with in a very long time, and that I come back here partly for the reason I stated and partly not." She did not look away. "The partly not," she said. "Yes," he said. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up and was doing something complicated with the beeches on the drive, and the house settled around them with the specific quietness of a house that has stood long enough to be comfortable in any weather. She had spent 2 years being afraid she would never get back here. She had spent 5 days being afraid she would be found out before she could find what she needed. She had spent 3 months being uncertain of what came next. She was not, she found, afraid of this. "I should probably clarify something," she said. "Should you? My position here is now official, documented. I'm not a servant anymore. Any conversation we have going forward would be equal," he said. She stopped. "I was going to say different in nature than what's been conventional." "That's a longer way of saying equal." She looked at him, and something that had been very carefully held in place for a long time loosened, slightly, at its edges. Not breaking open, she wasn't built for breaking open, but easing, in the way that something eases when the weather finally changes, when the long-held tension of a season resolves into whatever the next thing is going to be. "Yes," she said, "I suppose it is." Outside, the beeches moved, the fire settled. Harrowfield held its ground around them, solid and unhurried, the way it always had, the way she had always known, when it came to it, that it would.